The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsay. Part 10. Chapter 20. A Historical Fact. Amongst the weary hounds, refreshed with fury and triumph, Orion stepped with his whip and drove them away from the monstrous dead body, and sent the lash quivering round in a wide circle, while in his other hand he took his sword and cut off the unicorn's head. He also took the skin of the long white neck and brought it away, dangling empty from the head. All the while the hounds bayed and made eager rushes one by one at this magical carcass, whenever one saw a chance of eluding the whip, so that it was long before Orion got his trophy, for he had to work as hard with his whip as with his sword. But at last he had slung by a leather thong over his shoulder the great horn, pointing upwards past the right side of his head, and the smeared skin hanging down along his back. And while he arranged it thus, he allowed his hounds to worry the body again and taste the wonderful blood. Then he called to them and blew a note on his horn and turned slowly home towards Earl. And they all followed behind him, and the two foxes stole up to taste the curious blood, for they had sat and waited for this. While the unicorn was climbing his last hill, Orion felt such fatigue that he could have gone little further. But now that the heavy head hung from his shoulders, all his fatigue was gone, and he trod with a lightness such as he had in the mornings. For it was his first unicorn, and his hounds seemed refreshed as though the blood they had lapped had some strange power in it. And they came home riotously, gambling and rushing ahead as when newly loosed from their kennels. Thus Orion came home over the downs in the night, till he saw the valley before him full of smoke of Earl, where one late light was burning in a window of one of his towers, and coming down the slopes by familiar ways, he brought his hounds to their kennels, and just before dawn had touched the heights of the downs, he blew his horn before his postern door, and the aged guardian of the door, when he had opened it to Orion, saw the great horn of the unicorn bobbing over his head. This was the horn that was sent in later years as a gift from the Pope to King Francis. Benvenuto Cellini tells of it in his memoirs. He tells how Pope Clement sent for him and a certain Tobiah, and ordered them to make designs for the setting of a unicorn's horn, the finest ever seen. Judge then of Orion's delight when the horn of the first unicorn he ever took was such as to be esteemed generations later the finest ever seen, and in no less a city than Rome, with all her opportunities to acquire and compare such things. For a number of those curious horns must have been available for the Pope to have selected for the gift the finest ever seen. But in simpler days of my story, the rarity of the horn was so great that unicorns were still considered fabulous. The year of the gift to King Francis would be about 1530, the horn being mounted in gold, and the contract went to buyer, and not to Benvenuto Cellini. I mention the date because there are those who care little for a tale if it not be here and there supported by history, and whoever in history care more for fact than philosophy. If any such reader have followed the fortunes of Orion so far, he'll be hungry by now for a date or a historical fact. As for the date, I give him 1530, while for the historical fact, I select that generous gift recorded by Benvenuto Cellini, because it may very well be that just which he come to unicorns such a render may have felt furthest away from history, and have felt loneliest just at this point for want of historical things. How the unicorn's horn found its way from the castle of Earl, and in what hands it wandered, and how it came at last to the city of Rome, would of course make another book. But all I need say now about that horn is that Orion took the whole head to Threll, who took off the skin and washed it and boiled the skull for hours and replaced the skin and stuffed the neck with straw, and Orion set it in the midmost place among all the heads that hung in the high hall. And the rumour went all through Earl, as swift as a unicorn's gallop, telling of this fine horn that Orion had won. So that the Parliament of Earl met again in the Forge of Narl. They sat at the tables there debating the rumour, and others besides Threll had seen the head. And at first, for the sake of old divisions, some held to their opinion that there had been no unicorn. They drank Narl's goodly mead and argued against the monster. But after a while, whether Threll's argument convinced them, or whether, as is more likely, they yielded from generosity, which arose like a beautiful flower out of the mellow mead, whatever it was, the debate of those that opposed the unicorn languished. And when the vote was put, it was declared that Orion had killed a unicorn, which he had hunted hither from beyond the fields we know. And at this they all rejoiced, for they saw at last the magic for which they had longed and for which they had planned so many years ago, when all were younger and had had more hopes in their plans. And as soon as the vote was taken, Narl brought out more mead, and they drank again to mark the happy occasion. For magic at last, said they, had come on Orion, and a glorious future surely awaited Earl. And the long room and the candles and the friendly men and the deep comfort of mead made it easy to look a little way forward into the time and to see a year or so that had not yet come, and to see coming glories glowing a little way off. And they told again of the days, but nearer now, when the distant lands should hear of the vale they loved. They told again of the fame of the fields of Earl going from city to city. One praised its castle, another its huge high downs, another the vale itself, all hidden from every land, another the dear quaint houses built by an olden folk, another the deep of the woods that lay over the skyline, and all spoke of the time when the wide world should hear of it all, because of the magic that there was in Orion. For they knew that the world has a quick ear for magic and always turns towards the wonderful, even though it be nearly asleep. Their voices were high, praising magic, telling again of the unicorn, glorying in the future of Earl, when suddenly, in the doorway stood the Freer. He was there in his long white robe with its trimming of mauve, in the door with the knight behind him. As they looked, in the light of their candles, they could see he was wearing an emblem on a chain of gold around his neck. Narl bade him welcome, and some moved the chair to the table, but he had heard them speak of the unicorn. He lifted his voice from where he stood and addressed them. "Cursed be the unicorns," he said, "and all their ways and all things that be magic." In the awe that suddenly changed the mellow room, one cried, "Master, curse us not." "Good Freer," said Narl, "we hunted no unicorn." But the Freer raised up his hand against unicorns and cursed them yet. "Cursed be thy horn," he cried, "and the place where they dwell, and the lilies whereon they feed. Cursed be all songs that tell of them. Cursed be they utterly with everything that dwelleth beyond salvation." He paused to allow them to renounce the unicorns, standing still in the doorway, looking sternly into the room. And they thought of the sleekness of the unicorn's hide, his swiftness, the grace of his neck, and his dim beauty cantering by when he came past Earl in the evening. They thought of his stalwart and redoubtable horn. They remembered old songs that told of him. They sat in uneasy silence and would not renounce the unicorn. And the Freer knew what they thought, and he raised his hand again, clear in the candlelight, with the knight behind him. "Cursed be their speed," he said, "and their sleek white hide. Cursed be their beauty and all that they have of magic, and everything that walks by enchanted streams. and still he saw in their eyes a lingering love for those things that he forbade, and therefore he ceased not yet. He lifted his voice yet louder and continued, with his eyes sternly upon those troubled faces. And cursed be trolls, elves, goblins, and fairies upon the earth, and hippogriffs and pegasuses in the air, and all the tribes of the merfolk under the sea. Our holy right forbids them, and cursed be all doubts, all singular dreams, all fancies, and from magic may all true folk be turned away. Amen. He turned around suddenly and was into the night. A wind loitered about the door, then flapped it to, and the large room in the Forge of Null was as it had been a few minutes before, yet the mellow mood of it seemed dulled and dim. And then Null spoke, rising up to the table's end and breaking the gloom of the silence. "Did we plan our plans," he said, "so long ago, and put faith in magic, that we should now renounce magical things and curse our neighbours, the harmless folk beyond the fields we know, and the beautiful things of the air, and dead mariners' lovers dwelling beneath the sea?" "No, no," said some, and they quaffed their mead again. And then one rose with his horn of mead held high, then another, and then another, till all were standing upright all round the light of the candles. "Magic," one cried, and the rest with one accord took up his cry till they were all shouting, "Magic!" The friar on his homeward way heard the cry of magic. He gathered his sacred robe more closely around him, and clutching his holy things, and said a spell that kept him from sudden demons and the doubtful things of the mist. Chapter 21. On the Verge of Earth. And on that day Orion rested his hounds. But the next day he rose early and went to his kennels and loosened the joyous hounds in the shining morning, and led them out of the valley and over the downs towards the frontier of twilight again. And he took his bow with him no more, but only his sword and his whip, for he had come to love the joy of his 15 hounds when they hunted the one-horned monster, and felt that he shared the joy of every hound, while to shoot one with an arrow would be but a single joy. All day he went over the fields, greeting some farmer here and there, or worker in the field, and gaining greetings in return and good wishes for sport. But when evening came, and he was near the frontier, fewer and fewer greeted him as he passed, for he was manifestly travelling where none went, whence even their thoughts held back. So he went lonely, yet cheered by his eager thoughts, and happy in the comradeship of his hounds. And both his thoughts and his hounds were all for the chase. And so he came to the barrier of twilight again, where the hedges ran down to it from the fields of men, and turned strange and dim in a glow that is not of our earth, and disappeared in the twilight. He stood with his hounds close in against one of the hedges, just where it touched the barrier. The light just there on the hedge, if like anything of our earth, was like the misty dimness that flashes upon a hedge, seen only across one field, when touched by the rainbow. In the sky the rainbow is clear, but close one wide field the rainbow's end scarcely shows, yet a heavenly strangeness has touched and altered the hedge. In some such light as that glowed the last of the hawthorns that grew in the fields of men, and just beyond it, like a liquid opal, all full of wandering lights, lay the barrier through which no man can see, and no sound come, but the sound of the elfin horns. And only that to the ears of a very few. The horns were blowing now, piercing that barrier of dim light and silence with the magical resonance of their silver note. That seemed to beat past all things intervening to come to Orion's ear, as the sunlight beats through the ether to illume the veils of the moon. The horns died down, and nothing whispered from Elfland, and all the sounds thenceforth were the sounds of an earthly evening. Even these grew few, and still no unicorns came. A dog barked far away. A cart, the sole sound on an empty road, went homeward wearily. Someone spoke in a lane and then left the silence unbroken, for words seemed to offend the hush that was all over our fields. And in the hush Orion gazed at the frontier, watching for the unicorns that never came, expecting each moment to see one step through the twilight. But he had done unwisely in coming to the same spot at which he had found the 5 unicorns only 2 days before. For of all creatures the unicorns are the wariest, guarding their beauty from the eye of man with never-ceasing watchfulness, dwelling all day beyond the fields we know, and only entering them rarely at evening, when all is still, and with the utmost vigilance, and venturing even then scarcely beyond the edges. To come on such animals twice at the same spot within 2 days with hounds, after hunting and killing one of them, was more unlikely than Orion thought. But his heart was full of the triumph of his hunt, and the scene of it lured him back to it in the way that such scenes have. And now he gazed at the frontier, waiting for one of those great creatures to come proudly through, a great tangible shape out of the dim opalescence. And no unicorn came. And standing gazing there so long, that curious boundary began to lure him until his thoughts went roaming with its wandering lights, and he desired the peaks of Elfland. And well they knew that lure who dwelt on those farms, lying all along the edge of the fields we know, and wisely kept their eyes turned ever away from that wonder that lay with its marvel of colours so near to the backs of their houses. For there was a beauty in it such as is not in all our fields, and it is told those farmers in youth how, if they gaze upon those wandering lights, there will remain no joy for them in the godly fields, the fine brown furrows or the waves of wheat, or in any things of ours, but their hearts will be far from here with elfin things, yearning always for the unknown mountains, and for folk not blessed by the freer. And standing now, while our earthly evening waned, upon the very edge of that magical twilight, the things of earth rushed swiftly from his resemblance and remembrance, and suddenly all his care was for elfin things. Of all the folk that trod the paths of men, he remembered only his mother, and suddenly knew, as though the twilight had told him, that she was enchanted, and he of a magical line, and none had told him this, but he knew it now. For years he'd wandered through many an evening and guessed where his mother was gone. He had guessed in lonely silence. None knew what the child was guessing, and now an answer seemed to hang in the air. It seemed as though she were only a little way off across the enchanted twilight that divided those farms from Elfland. He moved 3 steps and came to the frontier itself. His foot was the furthest that stood in the fields we know. Against his face the frontier lay like mist, and which all the colours of pearls were dancing gravely. A hound stirred at his move. The pack turned their heads and eyed him. He stood and they rested again. He tried to see through the barrier, but saw nothing but wandering lights that were made by the massing of twilights from the ending of thousands of days, which had been preserved by magic to build that barrier there. Then he came and called to his mother across the mighty gap, those few preserved by magic to build that barrier there. Then he, upon one side of the earth in the haunts of men, and the time that we measure by minutes and hours and years, and upon the other Elfland and another way of time. He called to her twice and listened, and called again, and never a cry or a whisper came out of Elfland. He felt then the magnitude of the gulf that divided him from her, and knew it to be vast and dark and strong, like the gulfs that set apart our times from bygone day, or that stand between daily life and the things of dream, or between folk tilling the earth and the heroes of a song, or between those living yet and those they mourn. And the barrier twinkled and sparkled as though so airy a thing never divided lost years from that fleeing hour called now. He stood there, with the cries of earth faint in the late evening behind him, and the mellow glow of the soft earthly twilight, and before him, close to his face, the utter silence of Elfland, and the barrier that made that silence gleamed with its strange beauty. And now he thought no more of earthly things, but only gazed into that wall of twilight, as prophets tampering with forbidden lore gaze into cloudy crystals. And to all that were elvish in Orion's blood, to all that he had held of magic from his mother, the little lights of the twilight builded boundary, lured and tempted and beckoned. He thought of his mother dwelling in lonely ease beyond the rage of time. He thought of the glories of Elfland, dimly known by magical memories that he had had from his mother. The little cries of the earthly evening behind him he heeded no more nor heard, and with all these little cries were lost to him also the ways and the needs of men, the things they plan, the things they toil for and hope for, and all the little things their patience achieves. In the new knowledge that had come to him, beside the glittering boundary that he was of magical blood, he desired at once to cast off his allegiance to time and to leave the lands that lay under time's dominion, and were ever scourged by his tyranny, to leave them with no more than 5 short paces, and to enter the ageless land where his mother sat with her father, while he reigned on his misty throne in that hall of bewildering beauty, at which only song has guessed. No more was Earl his home, no more were the ways of man his ways, their fields to his feet no more. But the peaks of the elfin mountains were to him now what welcomed eaves of straw are to earthly labours at evening. The fabulous, the unearthly, were to Orion home. Thus had the barrier of twilight too long seen enchanted him, so much more magical was it than any earthly evening. And there are those that might have gazed long at it and even yet turned away, but not easily Orion. For though magic has the power to charm worldly things, they respond to enchantment heavily and slowly, while all that was magic in Orion's blood flashed answer to the magic that shone on the rampart of Elfland. It was made of the rarest lights that wander in air, and the fairest flashes of sunlight that astonish our fields through storm, and the mists of little streams and the glow of flowers in the moonlight, and all the ends of our rainbows with all their beauty and magic, and scraps of gloaming of evenings long treasured in aged minds. Into this enchantment he stepped, to have done with mundane things. But as his foot touched the twilight, a hound that had sat behind him under the hedge, held back from the chase so long, stretched its body a little and uttered one of those low cries of impatience that amongst the ways of men most nearly resembles a yawn. And old habit at the sound made Orion turn his head, and he saw the hound and went up to him for a moment and patted him, and would have said farewell, but all the hounds were around him, nosing his hands and looking up at his face, and standing there amongst his eager hounds, Orion, who but a moment before was dreaming of fabulous things with thoughts that floated over the magical lands and scolded the enchanted peaks of the elfin mountains, was suddenly at the call of all his earthly lineage. It was not that he cared more to hunt than to be with his mother beyond the fret of time, in the lands of her father, lovelier than anything song hath said. It was not that he loved his hounds so much that he could not leave them, but his father's had followed the chase age after age, as his mother's line had timelessly followed magic, and the call towards magic was strong, while he looked on magical things. And the old earthly line was as strong too, beckon him to the chase. The beautiful boundary of twilight had drawn his desires towards Elfland. Next moment his hounds had turned him the other way. It is hard for any of us to avoid the grip of external things. For some moments, Orion stood thinking among his hounds, trying to decide which way to turn, trying to weigh the easy, lazy ages that hung over untroubled lawns and the listless glories of Elfland, with the good brown plough and the pasture and the little hedges of earth. But the hounds were around him, nosing, crying, looking into his eyes, speaking to him if tails and paws and large brown eyes can speak, saying, "Away, away." To think amongst all that tumult was impossible. He could not decide, and the hounds had it their way, and he and they went together home over the fields we know. End of part 10. If you have been enjoying this audiobook, please take the time to subscribe. It would really help the station. If you could also like or leave a comment or share this station with other friends, that would be great. Thank you.